So it's just a little bit of an introduction into the fact that everything starts with the human person. And in bioethics, if we forget that this is a person and not a disease that's being treated, the whole thing goes south. Two, just as an aside, a lot of times, like in hospitals that have bioethics on staff and such, people get the impression that like an ethicist in a hospital is sort of like the sheriff, to make sure that they don't do anything they shouldn't be doing. That would be a really odd relationship to have. Ethicists are there to make sure that they can do their job well and freely. On cases that really are, confusing, dynamic, there's some principles that can be applied, some experiences that can be brought into it, and it really just becomes a conversation. So, hopefully, at least in the experience I've had talking to bioethicists at hospitals, they have a very good working relationship with the doctors and such, and the nursing staff and everything. You'll see it's broader than that. People that are also involved in the administrative aspects, that falls underneath this too. But nonetheless, so we're not going to go through this all again because we already had a really good segment on basic anthropology. So let's just do this as a recollection, right? If we are made in God's image, there were certain things that we understood this to pertain to. That we are rational beings. That we have freedom of choice and will, where everything's not determined with us. That we are relational beings, not just by we desire to be with others, but that the other person is a necessary part of our lives. We don't have an existence outside of that relationship. The Roman Catholic Church's understanding of the communion of saints is a beautiful aspect of this. We're contingent. We need not exist. God is the only non-contingent being. He is the one that must exist. We only exist we are sustained by his love. Let's say it that way. And we can't forget that this is not our home. So the last class, Strangers in a Strange Land, is just a reiteration that we are built for something outside of this. So everything that we feel, the lack of contentment that we feel in this world, it just fits our anthropology and understanding of the human person. And I add liturgical just so that we know it's not just relational, but the entire world is sacramental. We relate to the world through signs and images and wonders, and that's how God relates to us, and also how he relates to those people who don't profess a particular faith. So we have this understanding of the human person. We won't expand on it any more than that. But for the sake and purposes of what we're going to talk about tonight, it isn't that a secular view wouldn't say that man isn't rational, but they limit him to that reasoning capacity. So we'll see it's whether or not is the rationality manifested. So we'll play around and see what does that mean with the unborn, with a 3-month-old, with a 13-year-old, or with a person who might be suffering from some brain injury or dementia. We'll look at how did people develop. Now, I think, let me put these up so I forget what I'm going to be talking about next. We'll look at the background on this. How did we get to the point where we think that we're inside this body? In other words, I'm thinking inside my body. We'll look at how that transpired over the centuries. Also, that personhood has to do with a person knowing they're self-conscious. So this woman, and her husband, who are trying to get the embryos that died to be declared person, that's going to be one of the obstacles they come up against. There's no consciousness there. So they're going to say it's not the person, there's no free will that's exhibited. Can you really tell me that something that would fit on the end of a pencil point have the same personhood as me? They'll talk in those terms. So I'll give you something very concrete on how you would respond to that and the context that they say it in. But what that means then, and this is to use the words of some secular bioethicists, is that what remains is a web of sympathy. Even those people that aren't declared persons per se, they don't treat them like animals. They just say that there's a web of sympathy that exhibits out from our personhood, and because we understand that they are still part and parcel of our species, that we give them due consideration. That being said. So anyway, all I wanted to do with this slide is let's keep in mind that we have two very distinct and contrasting views of the human person. And if we don't settle that, it's going to be hard for us to walk on. Okay, so everybody knows the cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Now, this is dualism, but René Descartes was a very devout believer, so he wasn't saying we don't have a soul. And he understood, obviously, that we have a body. But what he did, in a sense, was, as we understand personhood to contain the body and the soul, he sees it more as it's the rationality of the human person. So the way that he came to this was, we doubt our senses. The example he used, if you put a stick into the water and you see the stick's bent, how do we know that, even though we know that might be a light refraction trick, how do we know that we don't have other events that are tricking our senses? We assume that what I see out there is reality. René Descartes questioned that. So it's Cartesian doubt, is what they would say. He did say that what would stop a demon, from letting us think that this is the reality? We might be fooled. Now, because he believed in God, he said God would not let that happen. But nonetheless, he thought even if we were being deceived by a demon, even if we're being deceived by our senses, aren't we still thinking about being deceived? So therefore, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. That's how he came to this. But it had a really revolutionary effect on philosophy and culture. The first few slides are really just talking about culture. It should be a course somewhere, so we could say, how did we get to this point, right? So it was turned towards the subject. This is Karl Wojtyła and Pope John Paul II in The Acting Person. And he says, many anthropologists have identified the human person primarily with the cognitive function, as if only in cognition, and especially through self-knowledge, that man can manifest himself and has his own prerogative. Well, if I think, therefore I am, what if you're not thinking? Then who are you? That's the issue here. Okay, that's the issue.
But that was not really Descartes. That wasn't his goal.
Well,
or was it his goal?
It was his goal. It was his goal to nobody does okay, this was philosophy, so it's not technically heresy, but nobody's purposely wrong, right? They really think they're solving an issue. And the issue here was, how could I know things out in the world? Because there are so many things that are deceptive. So he boiled it down to Cartesian doubt. I could at least say that. That's the one thing I could say for certain. Now, we have other issues with it, but nonetheless. He's the father of modern philosophy, by the way. Thomas Hobbes then comes along, and if any of these are out of order, that's all right. I'm not trying to give a history. And the courses that I even took here and other places, we cover all this. So this isn't something that just manifests because I have a love for philosophy. It's part and parcel of understanding how we got to this point. So Hobbes talks about the state of nature and the rules of reason. And, he sees nature as something that's very combative. And it's something that we have to work hard to overcome. So we're always in competition. It's might makes right. The person who has the means to get the best supplies to sustain themselves, they're going to win out. So how do we do this? How do we work with each other? Well, the only way to do it, and I'm doing this very briefly, hopefully not at the point where I'm not being accurate, but we're going to have to come into some social contract with each other. Let's just make an agreement, because otherwise, this is going to wind up being in the people who have power and might. So through rules of reason, we're going to have some convenient articles of peace, so that we all can live and not live in constant fear of being overtaken. Now, this and the John Locke, their understanding of nature is kind of what the early United States inherited. So pursuit of life, liberty, and property was originally what it was. They exchanged property for pursuit of happiness. But they said the reason why a person would live in community is so that we can basically build battlegrounds against those coming outside of us. See, that's contrary to our understanding of being very relational beings. We need each other, right? Our love sustains the other person, and we could not live in a community where we didn't share that love with other people. So how do you do this? Well, if you ever heard the term Leviathan, well, Leviathan's going to have to be this big government or whatever it is, something that has enough power to put all this thing in place. Otherwise, the powerful men are just going to take over. So anyway.
So Leviathan. But that was like a sea creature or something.
Well, it is.
Yeah.
But he uses that as a metaphor. In other words, we're going to need some sea creature that everybody fears. He just called whatever this institution is, he calls it Leviathan. So, very good. So then we come to the Age of Enlightenment in 2 bullet points. Talk about that. But here we have the rise of rationalism and secular humanism. Maybe you've heard the words positivism. They basically piggybacked off of Christianity, the French Revolution and such. And they just declared almost like a secular religion. So a philosophical movement away from placing our hope in God and turning towards reliance on the natural sciences and its technological applications. So we start to rely now on what can science do for us. And you'll see tonight that we still do this in the medical field. We just have this in the back of our heads that medicine can fix all things. All right? So theological, ethical, aesthetic knowledge, they're all relegated to the realm of fantasy and superstition. Now, neo-Marxists and such are kind of combating against this because they're almost anti-rationalists. Has nothing to do with tonight. It's just that you have this interesting play going on in culture today. So the identity politics and everything like that came out of cultural Marxism is also a reaction to the Enlightenment, just as much of what 20th century Catholic theology was a reaction to the Enlightenment. We just have 2 different solutions to what was happening here. Okay, so Immanuel Kant, everything's reason for him. We'll determine things by using rational thought. So you start to say a person is going to be a subject who's capable of having his actions imputed. He could be guilty for what he does. So this formalism. Moral goodness becomes a matter of universal form. And remember, the categorical imperative is, I don't will anything for myself or for you that I can't declare as universal. So I'm saying lying is wrong because I can't imagine living in a world where I would like Frank to lie to me. And I won't lie to him. So you declare something that can be categorical, universal. All right? So universal prescriptions are sought as opposed to a search for what leads to happiness. So we've now, and if you remember, this is deontology, right? We now are saying not what fulfills the human person, but what are universal prescriptions we can say works for everybody in morality. All right? Because we're doing Catholic bioethics, but the world's not Catholic, right? So our issue is how do we deal with institutions that aren't Catholic and hold our principles, and then also where do they get their principles from? How do they develop their principles? So there's a lot of things that this all plays into. So preferences, they provide men with values, but you don't base them on desires, only on pure reason. So he wrote a book, one of his books was Critique of Pure Reason. And Hans Urs Balthasar wrote some nice stuff against that and everything. But I'm not trying to give a short course in modern philosophy, just to say that some of the problems that we're up against have their roots here. Specifically with an understanding of rationality as the human person. If, how could an embryo think? Well, it can't. Well, then it's not a person. And we'll address that tonight, but it's where it got its root from. Friedrich Nietzsche, and he wrote in his Genealogy of Morals that moral sentiments, compassion, selflessness, and piety, they're just holdovers from Judeo-Christian ethics. Now, we would agree, so when people say secular ethics, they can determine for themselves outside of God what is right or wrong, they're now going to start disagreeing with Nietzsche. He's like, no, we got that from them. It's really hard to overcome that. In his Beyond Good and Evil, he proposed a shift from faith to rational science. So everybody knows the phrase God is dead. He wasn't declaring God dead. He was just saying, this is what's happened. We no longer need the God. And it's not because I've declared it. This is how culture is. We now have reason, we have science, we have empirical studies, and we have reason. So we can now determine morality based just on that. So he was opposed to any inherited tradition, and he wanted to overturn the truths and rigid thinking, and why he wrote his book Beyond Good and Evil. But we're going to get outside of these categories now. And I could just share with you, like when I speak with bioethicists who are atheists, they'll talk in these terms. I mean, they'll look at very utilitarian terms of what is good for the human person, for the human community. But if we have different understandings of the human person, if we have different understandings of the origins of good and what is good or evil, we're going to have a hard time coming together on many issues. If you read Alistair, if you ever get a chance to look at Alistair McIntyre's book, Back to Virtue, he really goes after emotivism. You're going to see this in our culture today. Moral judgments really express feelings. So rather than saying, that's wrong, I feel that's wrong. This is where a lot of this will come from. So morality is determined by sentiment. So the approbation or blame cannot be the work of a judgment, but it's the work of the heart. And it's not a speculative proposition, and I'm not affirming. I'm not saying, yes to anything in particular. It's just I'm activating my own feelings and my own judgments on these things. So we are now in the sense where, this is where you see the web of sympathy build. You'll see maybe this, and I'm not against treating animals well, but if you see somebody who proposes almost treating them to the same level as some humans, they're extending the web of sympathy even beyond the human animal to other animals. So you could be in conversations with many philosophers who want to know, and I've been asked, well, how do you feel about the consciousness of non-human beings? Well, okay, well, we don't have a lot to go on. And again, I'm not going to litigate that here tonight, but it's funny how, we might attribute what we would call anthropomorphic feelings to gorillas, orangutans, dogs, and such, but we never hold them accountable. I mean, a dog might be put down, but it's not put down because it was a bad dog. It's put down because it can't be controlled, and it's dangerous in the neighborhood or something. But we've never put these animals on trial, so we don't hold them to the same level of guilt. It's one of these things where the web of sympathy goes out there, but it's not played all the way through. Okay. So now we'll get into the Catholic understanding here. And this comes out of Benedict Ashley, Healthcare Ethics. I never had him as a professor. He was a lecturer, but I had Father Brian Milady sat in for him, as I guess they called it. He was like the liaison between him and Father Ashley. But it's a classic textbook on bioethics. This and William May is another. So what happened is at a certain point, healthcare decisions were no longer the monopoly of the medical profession, nor were the ethical questions simply the monopoly of the clergy. So, probably towards the late 1800s and 1900s, these things started to converge. Well, how do we handle this now? Okay, we can't just call in the clergy for the ethical and ask the doctor for the medical professional opinion. So institutes that were once solely under Catholic dominion, if you want to call it that, the Hastings Center in New York, and then at Georgetown University, the Kennedy Institute for Ethics. Well, as they became secularized, the Catholic Church said, well, okay, if this is going to happen, then what are going to be the guidelines? Because, if you want to maintain Catholic identity and you want to maintain Catholic healthcare, then that word has to mean something. So this is where the ethical and religious directives came about. And you could always go to those in the future for any particular concern you have. And if you really had a specific concern, you could even call the National Catholic Bioethics Center here in Philly, and they have on-staff experts that can help you in situations if you really had something that was a conundrum for you. But the URDs were basically the response to the secularization. And this is what I mean by I put all the notes up there for you, just so you have them. They said there was a three-stage development. One, we didn't want to perceive dehumanization go on in medical education. And then, since there is such a rapid, and it's even more rapid now, a rapid pace of biological research, we have to have some rigorous analysis in place so we don't let the research get ahead of the ethical, I don't want to call it constraints, because that sounds then it's almost like the sheriff coming in. But as long as we understand the freedom is to do something well, we need ethical standards in place to help the Catholic healthcare workers to do what they're doing well, okay? And global, I mean, it's worldwide, all right? I mean, it's hard for the community hospitals are already on their way out. Every hospital gets bought out, and it's getting bigger, and pharmaceuticals are getting bigger, and it's obviously across boundaries. And two, this is multidisciplinary. So this is not just ethics. You got to bring in social workers. You got to bring in psychology. You got to bring in business ethics people. I mean, there's a lot of people that have to come into bear. And I don't know how you could be an expert on all of this. So it becomes a real team effort. All right. Yes.
What's the ERD for?
Ethical and religious directives. I did not finish. I started taking the certification here, and I got through half the year with Father Tad, and I don't have any use for it, and there's only so many things in life you can do. So I just stopped at that point. But a lot of this comes from the notes that I had in that class. Okay. So Pope John Paul II, he weighs in here and says, look, there's a twofold transcendence in order to we go outside of ourselves. First of all, we go outside ourselves in relation to nature through our spiritual acts of intellectual cognition, love and freedom. He says, then also we have a relation with the community through acts that are bound with moments, our rights, religious dignities and such. So he stresses the value of the person must be clearly distinguished from any value that's present in the person. So, we just look at the person as a whole as a value. We're not going to start looking at some utility in it, like what is this person's value to me? Now we're in that other part of it. There are two forms of use. So you are neither inborn nor acquired, right? They are part of your person, which is why we would say from the moment of fertilization. And you'll see it's a better term than conception. If you use fertilization, it's very clean. So they're linked to the whole complex of our existence. Love and responsibility. It's a wonderful text. What I'll do is just talk about these, and then I don't think I listed them because I didn't want to add more than I had to, but I'll read some bullet points from the URDs just so you get a feel for what's in there. But they say right up front, here's our goal. We want to affirm ethical standards that flow from the dignity of the human person. We want authoritative guidance on very specific issues. This can't just be abstract. What do I do here? And then professionals, patients, families, they need principles and guidelines. How do you make decisions when you're in the hospital with mom, yourself, your spouse, children, whatever? How do I make decisions while I'm in there? So some of the things that they spoke about, medical care must always advocate for the marginalized and vulnerable. You have to use resources responsibly. Nobody wants to talk about it, but we don't have unlimited financial resources to heal every single person to the nth degree. Always address the whole human person. A patient has a right to make treatment decisions, so they need to have informed consent. fertility and infertility treatments. Specifically, IVF, abortion, and direct sterilization are never to be performed in a Catholic hospital or a facility that they're connected with. Prenatal diagnosis, as long as you could do something with it, absolutely. I know, like, when my children were born, they're now in their mid to late 20s, they had asked us, do you want to do, any sort of test? And I said, well, what are you testing for? And they didn't say. I said, you're testing for Down syndrome and all. And they said, well, yeah, so that you can have a more informed choice. I said, if you find an issue, is there something you can do about it in utero? Or would it help me prepare better as the child's being born? They said, not really. I said, we're good. At some point. But we have ways to make that decision. We'll talk about extraordinary and proportionate care. Euthanasia, obviously not. Tissue and organ donation, absolutely encouraged. You don't take them with you, right? And then the last thing they really drive home is scandal. So you'll see when we talk about how do we cooperate with the secular world, how far can we go? Even at the end, even if we are permitted to do something, we have to consider, are we causing a scandal by this association? If you want something that's not related to bioethics, it would be like if a woman a young girl, she's 23, puts out an ad for a roommate, and a male shows up. And there is absolutely no relationship sexually between them. He simply rents a room. You would have to consider, am I giving the impression to the community that we are living together? Now, I'm not saying that's not moral to do, but it would have to be part of the consideration. So likewise, even when certain things are permitted within the religious directives, we still have to ask, is what I'm doing, would it scandalize somebody with a weak faith? That's part of the discussion.
Explain it a little bit more.
Well, okay, I'll jump ahead here. Like, it is totally, there was a bunch of us in the class that thought this was cooperation, but that it was permitted. Father Tad thought it didn't even count as cooperation. If you were a garbage collector, would you own the business, would you take on a hospital taking care of the medical waste if you knew they were performing abortions regularly at that hospital? Well, a lot of us said, I'd make me sick, but it's really, you'll know what this means later, it's remote mediate material cooperation, so it's permissible. He said, no, it's not permissible at all. Well, somebody might say, well, I don't even know if I want to do that because I don't want my name on the sides of those trucks associated with that. So somebody's, now that, I'm saying that's not a scandal, but somebody would consider, is what I'm doing a scandal? And, even though I'm permitted to do this, does this cause, if a Catholic institution is not merging, but sharing services with a secular hospital that's doing something that goes against our moral standards, does that association make us think, what are you doing? Why are you doing this with them? Now, that doesn't mean that they're not allowed, but you're going to have to consider, am I causing a scandal? Now, we can go on and on about this. It is subjective, because, you would think that if it's clear enough and you could explain it, and I'm not responsible for every blessed person in the world that doesn't know that that's my sister living with me, but at some point, would I have to, be concerned with it? So just something to keep in mind. Okay, we're going to talk just about some of the major documents. This is a pretty central one, Evangelium vitae. I don't really want to just sit here and read that, but and I put the section numbers down in case you wanted to go and reference it. But we can't have a self-centered concept of freedom, right? We can't talk about having children as an obstacle to something we want to do. He quotes, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Yes, and the answer to that's pretty simple. Yes, you are. But a culture of death has taken over. So now we have, it's always the weak and the poor always get screwed. There's no other way to say it. And the people who have power and have money tend to fare out on top. which is odd why more people aren't championing the unborn. I mean, that's an odd irony in our culture. I like this part. Watch the euphemisms, because really that's a sign that there's something with your conscience. You can't say we're killing the unborn child in the womb. We're having a selective reduction. I mean, so you think at the times they use euphemisms, he points out, doesn't that reflect in our society that we have a problem already with our conscience? And democracy, we can't idolize democracy to the point where it's a substitute for our morality. All right. Now, why I did put these in the notes, because if we do like dialectic or something, you have this stuff. And maybe you might want to search other stuff, and you're ready with it, right? And, you'll find, obviously, in the secular discussions, you can't quote these, but you can summarize them, because the points are pretty good, rather than saying, well, in Evangelium vitae, section 29 or whatever, it says that euphemisms are really a way that we appease our conscience. Well, that's not going to, impress anybody. But if you say, why don't we call things by their names? If you have no issue with it, then call it by its name. Let's say what it is. That could be, in the secular conversation, that could be part of it. Donum vitae from the CDF is the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So he talks about therapeutic intervention. If you can heal a malady, if there's some chromosomal deficiency or defect that you can overcome, well, then that's fine. You'll see that you're treating a pathology, and that's desirable. But it has to be done without doing harm to the integrity or worsening the condition of life.
And what would that be?
Well, I think maybe an example of this would be, okay, like when the doctor had asked about, drawing some fluid from my wife's uterus to see, okay, there's risk. I mean, I'm not saying that something can happen, but there's a risk. Immediately I weigh that. Now if they had some indication and came to me and said, we have reason to believe because of ultrasounds or whatever that there's an issue here. And I think that if we can draw some fluid, we may not be able to correct it, but we can help you prepare, or at least we can be prepared here at the facility to receive this child. Okay, now that's a good thing. But if they're looking at it simply because, you may want to consider whether or not, this is viable. They'll use words like that. Well, okay, we know it's viable. I mean, she's not in a spontaneous abortion here that's going on. But so there's other things that probably come up if I think of any. We'll look at fertility treatments. As long as you can help the act, help fulfill what the act is trying to do and not circumvent it, okay? And we'll look at those. There's gamete intrafallopian transfers. They'll take like a catheter and put like the egg and the sperm separated by air, and enter it. Now, is that circumventing? We say yes. Is there a blockage? Can we remove the child along the blockage? There's all kinds of things. And some of these, the church has not, put their foot down and say, this is the line. There are lines, but some of those are, there's a part of a discussion. Because obviously anybody that's been involved in medicine with your family knows that everything's not so clean. Like this is the only thing wrong with you and you have a 51% chance. I mean, nothing works like that, right? This is the Declaration on Procured Abortion. You'll see at some point, if it doesn't say it here, that most things are supererogatory. In other words, a woman, if a woman is told that your pregnancy can be difficult, well, they can weigh that out. I mean, what are we talking here? Well, you're going to have to take it easy, don't lift anything, and bed rest for the last 3 months. I find that to be reasonable if my family we want this child, so that's not an unreasonable burden. That's not dismissing that bodily life is not, fundamental good, all right? We're not saying that. But we always would risk our health for certain things. So we all believe as Christians that there are higher goods than bodily health. We say that without dismissing the bodily health. Before anybody starts thinking that the Catholic Church believes that, save the baby at any cost, and, if the mother dies, well, then she died giving birth to the child. That's not a Catholic position. That's just some figment that's easy to, argue against. But we'll talk about that later. But when they say, let me see. I should have put the context for that second one. All right. We'll start to see that many things are incommensurable. You can't weigh them out. So if we're going to say that the child's going to have certain issues ahead, well, what do we weigh that against? I mean, if we not that we do, but if we had a scale, what do we put on both sides of the scale here? We're having problems with our proportionalism again. I really should have put down context. We'll leave it at there. I have all the lesson plans done for, till the end. So the problem with that is sometimes I forget what I was thinking. And this is one of them. Declaration of Euthanasia. We're going to distinguish between suicide and allowing someone to die. Two different objects. So we're going to talk about euthanasia. It's really going to be found in the intention of the will. And that death is not always sudden, but it often is preceded by long periods of suffering. How do we address that without pretending, that some people, and there have been saints, I can't remember, was it Saint Therese that wanted to suffer more towards the end? I know that she didn't withhold certain medication, but there's been saints that have. And the church says, that's fine within a balance here. I guess you can get different opinions on self-flagellation and stuff, but that's not my thing. I think if you're hitting yourself with a whip, we need to talk. I mean, that's my opinion. But okay, I'm not making fun of anybody that might be in. What's the? My mind is from blank. Yeah, it's a massive. But what group is that? Opus Dei. I'm not. That seems to be. Some of the people that are proponents of that is their spirituality. Although when I was first married, I used to sleep on the floor in solidarity. I did that for so long. You get start getting older, you just can't do that. It's like at some point you need a crane brought in to get you up off the ground. But anyway. It will be possible to make a correct judgment as to the means by studying the type of treatment to be used, the complexity or risk, its cost, the possibilities of using it, comparing these elements with the result that can be expected, and then taking into account the state of the sick person. Let me jump ahead, because maybe this will make this clear. When my mother, she had a vaginal anal fistula, and they found a spot on her lung. Before they found a spot on her lung, the surgery was a little bit too risky. So we were just saying no. It was manageable. But when they had to put in like a weeping tube, that almost became unmanageable. So at some point they said, we suggest removing the tube and just allowing her to die naturally. Well, now I'm not saying you stay alive for any reason, but I also have enough ethical background to say, well, now if we have a chance to get through this surgery, that's life-saving surgery, and it's not that irregular to be done. What happened though, which we thought would be the problem, is that she had got septic like about a week or so afterwards. Okay, well at that point, you don't intubate or anything like that. So you're starting to make these things, but I'm going to jump ahead and just say, because we'll get to this, the Catholic Church in living wills, they're a little leery on this. Not that they don't think it's a good idea, but how are you going to anticipate all the scenarios and all the possibilities and all the probabilities. So I taught this class, a bioethics class before, and there were two lawyers in the room that thoroughly disagreed with me and said that you can account for all that. Well, I don't know that I'm right, and I wasn't here to argue it. But when I was in the hospital with my mom, it's funny how, people just bring up things before you know you're having conversations with doctors about bioethics. And this guy was literally coming, he wasn't even helping my mom. He would just come to talk for like a half an hour here and there. So we started talking about living wills and everything. And I had told him that the Catholic Church prefers a proxy, somebody who could stand in place and make the decisions. And I was there. I'm at the Reading Hospital. I just tell me what's going on and we'll make these decisions. And he had said that, he has all the probabilities built into his living will. And, so if this happens, depending on the percentage of outcome. And I said, well, that's pretty thorough. I said, but who will read that in an emergency? And how will you determine that? And he goes, well, that is an issue, but at least I have something down in paper, so if there is a prolonged event, they can consult it. He said, I'll tell you, he goes, as a doctor, when a woman, like most people say, I don't want to be on a respirator. Well, you have to watch what you mean by that. Because sometimes that could be therapeutic to move you to a safer stage. Or it could be an induced coma. I mean, and this is where the lawyers are saying, well, you can word it differently. Yeah, but the doctors that I was talking to said, even people who are very clear on the DNR, their kids can override that. And it's different when it's happening, and here stands the kids, and that's mom. And he said, I can't even tell you how many times the kids just said, innovate. So this gets, it's just nice to have somebody there if you could.
But I think the important part of that is not just a piece of paper, it's a conversation and a discussion. I mean, that's the gist of it. I mean, if you just have a paper and you're not really talking to somebody,
that's right.
If you're going to be a healthcare proxy, I think you really need to know what they want.
You really do. I mean, it has to be somebody close. It has to be somebody close. And even then, in an emergency, I mean, what are they going to rush you into the ER? So I mean, so what I did with my mom, because we were visiting and I didn't see anything imminent, I said no. I said full resuscitation, and then as it's happening, hopefully I can make a decision. But it's tough. I mean, it's hard. Now, if she would have survived, way past the operation, now the cancer at her age, now that's a different story. I mean, are we going to go in after that, or are we now doing something that we'll see a little bit later? Is that disproportionate? I mean, because like my wife works in a nursing home some evenings, and there was a 94-year-old woman that had breast cancer surgery, perfectly fine. I mean, health-wise, she's a different person. I mean, you can't come out of operations like that at that age with no effect. Now, is it worth it? Sure. I mean, it wasn't that it wasn't worth it, but she's not the same person. So this is hard, and we're all living longer. I mean, this is part of the idea. I mean, when the life expectancy, if you were born in the 20s, was 49. Even if of course, people lived in their 60s, but now, I mean, we're living longer, and we have so many things that are available to us. How invasive is it? What's our chances here? Get a second opinion. I mean, it could be exhausting, and you're never in the right moment. I mean, this is it's like you're in the moment, and I'll tell you, I was there when my mom died, and boy, just to feel the weight on the shoulder of making these calls, Now, fortunately, you just would have to know my mom. She, real short story is like this woman had the faith of 20 saints. It was unbelievable. Priests would come over our house like to cook for her and stuff. I mean, it's like she'd give them her blessing, But she would like when she's when you're in the hospital and you're older for some time, all of a sudden your mind's not all there. You haven't lost it, but you're disoriented. And she would yell at me for leaving the spaghetti out and everything in her hospital room. And she kept talking about this stinking fly, It won't go away. It's over there all the time, Stevie. And the nurse is like, there's no flies in the hospital. I look over and there's a fly. We thought that she was nuts. And she wouldn't let us swat it. She said, it's my guardian angel. Well, this went on for 3 or 4 days. This fly's in the room. And it's still there. And it's not leaving her bedside. And she keeps saying, "That's my guardian angel." And we're joking, like, yeah, this is what we get, you know. When they were wheeling her down the hall to have her surgery, the attendant said, "There's a fly on your gurney going down." And my mom says, "Leave it alone." You know? So anyway. Okay. Now, I'm not even going to read through this because I'm very visual. So you've probably already seen on the next slides a graph, a chart. We're just going to go right to that. But here's the issue. You know, we don't live in a full Catholic world. We have to get along with other people, and we have to cooperate with them. But at some point, we draw the line. Well, where do we draw the line? So I just have some, examples that wouldn't even apply to like medicine. Is it illicit for a banker to give loans to people you're unable to pay? I had, a relative who was, he was in, I guess he helped out with loans for, what do you call them?
St. Leon.
No, my mind's totally gone. It's too simple of a term. Franchises. So he would help people secure loans to get these franchises. And he told me, he said, "I never did one single thing illegal." He said, "But I knew full out. There's no way. I knew they were not going to make it." He said, "But, so, I mean, okay, do we do that? Now maybe I'm not making the call. Maybe I'm just an assistant setting up the appointment. Maybe your boss is a real schmuck and you're just the secretary. What do you do? Are you okay there? Or I'm investing funds in companies that are exploiting other people." It's funny, I went to the local ministerium in my area, and it's almost all Mennonite, and it was like a Mennonite investment group. I don't remember I do remember the name. Because it was punny. It was, now I'll think of it in a minute. But they said, we don't allow investments, like if you want to safe with us, we don't allow investments in the sin stop, tobacco, alcohol, and such. Okay, well, I lived next to Amish for some time. I saw enough tobacco fields, but and you're worrying about cigarettes and alcohol, but really, what about all the other things that go on? I mean, so how do you classify this, right? How about if you're a nurse? Would you help out on an abortion? Would you even work in the same hospital wing? Or an engineer that keeps the mechanicals for the clinic going? Or if you're just a taxi driver and you're dropping a lady off at Planned Parenthood? How about exaggeration in advertising? Can we advertise in any venue? Is it illicit to deceive when you're promoting a product? Not exaggerate, but deceive. Again, if you look at, and I can't think of his name right now, Freud's nephew, it'll come to me. You've heard of focus groups in politics, and that all came from Freudian analytics. If you go and study the history of it. They couldn't sell cigarettes to women. Women weren't buying them in the 20s. It was a manly thing, rolling your tobacco and everything. So what they did was they hired models to march in parades with cigarettes that were referred to as victory sticks. And the more well-to-do women started smoking it, made it casual, and poof, there you go. This stuff goes on all the time, though, in advertising. Instant cake mix. What do you add to an instant cake mix? Yeah, why? I mean, what? They can't put powdered egg in it? Have you ever wondered that? This is the truth.
Makes it feel real.
When they did the studies, when Betty Crocker was doing the studies early on, and I know this sounds funny to us in our age, but when they had it, it was fully, all dehydrated stuff, and you could just mix it with water. Women felt that. I am not doing enough for my husband. He works all day hard, and all I'm doing is mixing this with water. I know that sounds stupid.
I hear you.
So this is your life, right? So what they did was, little by little, they found out where's the threshold. And the act of cracking an egg and adding it made the woman feel involved enough in the process that she reduced her guilt. And to this day, we put eggs in, or oil or something. Anyway. You get no cake. Yeah. You get Tandy cakes. She won't even take the plastic off. Okay, so what we did here was, when I was in the course with Father Taz, we all got together, at least my particular group, and said, we got to map this out. Because when it was all just put into, paragraph form, it wasn't that we couldn't read it, but, I was getting a little confused. Okay, so basically they follow, Aristotle had 4 causes, right? The formal cause, the material cause, the efficient cause, the final cause. That's how something changes. So most things are put into the text of formal and material. So a formal cause is determined by, do you concur with what you're doing? Okay? If you concur with what you're doing, then you are formally cooperating in that evil. All right? They break that into 2 ways. They will say that you are and the way you read this is you read up. Explicit formal cooperation with evil. Okay? If you are the doctor or the nurse that's in on the abortion and you're good with it because this is the woman's right and I am giving her what she wants, you then are explicit, formal, cooperating with evil. Obviously bad. Okay. If you are a doctor or a nurse who's still doing it, you're still involved in the formal act, but you're there, it's my benefits, I'm in the practice, you have some other good. And remember, it's an apparent good. It's not like a true good. There's some other good that you are involved with. You would be said to cooperate implicit formal cooperation with evil.
Which one?
Implicit formal cooperation.
Still bad, though.
Oh, this is the only good one.
Okay, right.
This is the only good one. This is all bad. If you are a nurse who thinks abortion is wrong, you don't concur. I don't agree with this. I'm operating the suction. And what I'm doing, in other words, it's essential. You take me out of the equation, this isn't happening. All right? Now, somebody might say, well, let's get another nurse. That's right, get another nurse. I'm not doing it. In other words, at some point, are we going to be courageous people? So this is the nurse who thinks abortion is wrong. She would be materially cooperating because she doesn't concur with it. But what she's doing is essential. So they would call that immediate material cooperation with evil. If you drive your friend to Planned Parenthood because she wants to have an abortion, I'm going to go have my, child taken care of. Can you give me a ride? Okay, if you say yes to that, what you're doing is order to the act. You may not agree. You may try to talk her out of it the whole way there, but it's a direct influence on what's happening. That is proximate, immediate, material cooperation with evil. I know it's a mouthful, but this is how the Catholic Church would spread this out.
Say it again.
It is proximate, immediate, material cooperation with evil. If you are a nurse who works in the hospital on the wing where abortions and you take vitals, that room, maybe the woman's being prepped for abortion, that room, maybe a hysterectomy. You're just taking vitals. You don't concur. What you are doing is certainly not essential, and it certainly has no direct influence on what's happening. All right? You may have pangs of conscience. All right? You may be worried about scandalizing things. Right? But as long as you're doing that, that's permissible. All right? That's permissible. This would be somebody too, like if, now you notice I said a person who drives a friend to Planned Parenthood to have an abortion. But if somebody said, can you drive me, like a taxi driver, it's remote, immediate, cooperating with evil. You don't concur, it's not essential, you're not doing anything ordered towards the act. Now, I don't know if they told you along the way, this is what I'm doing, get out. Now, I had a friend who used to install phone systems in business, and he was installing a phone system in a business where they primarily did abortions. And he called me up and said, I'm having pangs of conscience. I said, well, I think I would too. He said, I don't think I should do this. I don't think the church would allow me. I said, well, no, they would. I said, you're not, I can tell you where you'd be on this. I'm not saying that you should do it. What am I not supposed to follow my conscience? Well, yes, but a conscience can also be scrupulous, just like it could be loose, right? So if you have a problem with it, then go with that. But don't put it that you're not permitted, that type of thing. if somebody were to say, well, I don't want to send dues into the Lions Club, I'm making this up, because they send money to Africa and it's used in one particular area where I heard some of that goes to abortions and other types of situations. Is this a sin? Okay, if you've got to get some forensic accountant involved to figure out where this is going or coming from, no, this is not even a cooperation with evil problem. If it hurts your conscience, it's a little scrupulous. I think there's bigger things you should, in other words, you're probably cooperating in things, what you're purchasing, that are doing a bigger effect than that, but, hey, you do what you want, you're still a free person. But this is how situations would be laid out to determine, am I allowed to cooperate in what's doing? And again, this is not just, physicians and nurses. This could be administrative. If we're joining with this other hospital in our services, and they provide, they do embryonic stem cell research. How do we cooperate? Now, we're not going to settle that tonight because we wouldn't have all the factors. But this would be the way a person would go about to determine whether or not cooperating, because here's the problem. Do good and avoid evil. But we don't live in a world where we can sometimes we're going to do, there's evil, we can't get away from it. I can't buy this without somehow somebody is being, how do you want to say, not treated well in their business. So do I only buy things from the guy down the street that grows his own vegetables? How do I know? Maybe it's his kids. You know what I mean? Our problem is we live in a pluralistic world, and you can't get away from this. So if we can't get away from this, where do we draw the line? Where do we stand up with courage and say, won't do it? And this is what the ERGs will do. The ERGs give us these guidelines and such for us to make these decisions. All right?
How about, Professor, how about donating to organizations or purchasing goods and services from companies that you find out, hypothetically, donate some of their money to Planned Parenthood, or organizations that the church disagrees with?
Well, okay, now here's where the scandal would probably come in. If it's very public and there's notoriety on that, and you are publicly supporting them, even if you might be permissible to do it, according to this, that's probably not a good thing. Because somebody's going to say, well, what are you giving money to them for? In other words, we're not going to get into the debate whether the Planned Parenthood does mammograms and everything, but people are saying they still do the good there. Okay, yes, but if I have X amount of dollars to give to women's health care facilities and clinics, don't have other options, So and this is why years ago, it's not an issue now, a lot of the Catholic churches shied away from crop law because of the way the funds were used. There was nothing necessarily evil with crop law.
What is crop?
You would sponsor people to walk so many miles. A lot of churches, they still do it. They use our church as the rest stop. But they were using monies in areas of the world to certain ends that went against our Catholic moral underpinnings. So I know, maybe if the archdiocese didn't have it, it wasn't an issue. But in the Harrisburg diocese, for a while, everybody knew, don't get involved with it. Because that would have, even if it would have been remote, hey, everybody knows that they send money over for that. And look, here they are at the Catholic Church. It's just one of those things where the scandal breeds an issue, which is always something we have to keep in the back of our minds. Now, they took care of that, but nonetheless. Well, let me see how much. Oh, one more, and then we'll take a break. This is the last principle that we're going to go over. Sometimes you're going to try to do something good, and something bad is going to come out of it. And there's nothing you can do. If a person did have gangrene or diabetic neuropathy that got to the point where they had to amputate the leg, if you just said to somebody, am I allowed to amputate a leg? Why? Okay, so we're going to have to determine, that's not something good to do. But if something good's going to come out of it, how do we do this? So you can see this goes always back to Aquinas. And a lot of times Aquinas would talk about it in terms of self-defense. I'm not permitted just to kill somebody, but I can use lethal force to protect myself and my family. Now maybe legally you could do so to protect your TV, but I help. like younger people would say, well, I know you can shoot them as long as you're in your house. I'm like, what do you guys like watch? You know, I mean, plus, who cares what, you know, maybe Lenny Briscoe said that on Law and Order or something. I love Lenny. But the reality is morally, you can't shoot somebody for stealing your TV. I mean, yeah, come on. I mean, this is a TV. If you're such a good shot that you can take out their legs or something, okay, then fine. I don't know, you know. But I got a story. My father-in-law was a state policeman, and when I lived down in the lower part of the county, right on the Maryland border, nobody around us. It was me, my wife, and my, at the time, 3-year-old daughter, and my wife was pregnant, and somebody came in to the house. I heard them going on in the basement. Now, I did not grow up in a nice neighborhood, so this was nothing for me. This is like games on, right? My wife is like, what are you doing? You can't leave me up here pregnant with a kid. I thought about it. I thought, well, she's right, you know. So I just called 911. Well, I thought that I lived in Oxford. I didn't. And the guy says, are you sure they're down there? I said, are you asking me to go check? You know? Well, anyway, he says, where do you live? And I told him. He says, well, that's state police. Well, what a different environment. I called state police. They come flying in, whatever. So here's my father-in-law. He says, how old were the state police? Because I do pottery. I'm an artist. I said, well, they were young. They looked, they were just, you know, probably in their early 20s, mid-20s. He goes, figures. He said, if that was older guys, they'd have been asking all kinds of questions. How do you make this stuff? How long have you been making pottery? He said, but my father-in-law said, you know, the problem is, like he had said, you know, that guy could, you know, shoot indiscriminately. This is just his philosophy. You're responsible for every bullet that leaves a chamber. So his advice, you know, I don't own a gun, was to get a double-barrel shotgun and leave the first chamber empty. He says, everybody knows what that sound is. He says, but nonetheless, okay, this is where Aquinas builds it off of self-defense. That was really getting off the target here. But yes.
So were they still there when the police came?
No, because I heard him leave. And we had one of these doors that it was a bi-level, and the garage was kind of like you walk in the garage, you go up to the house or down to the basement, and the door to going down to the basement just had like a spring on it, so it was very distinct. You could hear it slam, which is why I knew somebody was down there, but nonetheless. Okay, so this would be. We're going to apply these to various situations, like if a woman's pregnant and has uterine cancer, what do we do? If a woman's pregnant and wants, you know, liposuction, what do we do? I mean, we could apply this to all the situations. So at first we're going to say, is what we're doing, is the act at least neutral or good? It can't be an intrinsic evil. Like if this is, you know, killing an innocent, it's already off the table, all right? So which doesn't make this fall underneath proportionalism. We're not just weighing things. We are weighing stuff, but we're starting with intrinsic evils. And it also takes away, you know, the situation ethics. The bad effect can be foreseen but not intended, all right? So let's use an example that a woman has aggressive uterine cancer. And a team of surgeons have said, if we don't do something now, treat this woman with radiation, her survival rate's almost nothing. Okay, at that point now, we're saying, what is the act? What is the object we're doing here? You're trying to treat the pathology of the woman, okay? The bad effect can be foreseen. Chances are the unborn child will die. We know that, okay? But we don't intend it, okay? We know that, but we don't intend it. Is there proportion between the good and the bad effect? Yes, we're talking life. This is even Steven, all right? This is even Steven. This isn't, you know, she was thinking of getting some particular cosmetic surgery and now it's to be put off and insurance is going to go up. I mean, we're not talking about things that are just, you know, night and day. The last one is the intention of the subject has to be directed towards the good effect and the bad effect tolerated. In other words, the woman was not, if the child died when she was being treated for uterine cancer, the death of the child didn't cure her. She wasn't cured by the bad effect, okay? She was not cured by the bad effect. The bad effect basically was a result of what was being done. Now, I think I wrote down, at least in my notes, other situations. Let me see here if I can think of one. Oh, is there another slide after this?
Yeah.
helmet on. Okay, here's and I think I get this right out of the National Catholic Bioethics Center. A woman she's pregnant and she has hypertension, and her pregnancy is really aggravating the hypertension, and it's prior to viability. So the doctor recommends, because we're so concerned about this hypertension, we're saying that we should abort the unborn fetus. Okay. Well, right off the bat, we have an issue because we're calling this is an abortion. All right. So the object of the act is abortion. The bad effect, which is the death of the child, is not just foreseen. You're intending it. You're doing it. I will do this. Right. The healing of the hypertension, number 3, it's the direct result. Okay, it's a direct result. Now, maybe, no, I'm sorry, they list them different here. Proportion, it isn't that the life will be saved, it's that her health will be more secure. Okay, so we're not even Steven here. And the intention, the woman's health is immediately restored by the death of the child. So the bad effect actually ends by causing the good effect. All right? So that would be impermissible. If it were uterine cancer and the idea was that this woman is not going to live if we don't do something now. Now, the woman can still be heroic, St. Giannabella, but that's supererogatory. That's not what we're talking about here. Morality is only saying what is required of the person. So what's required here is if somebody said, well, can this woman be treated? And could we watch how things go? Maybe we can at least get the woman to viability, the child to viability. And then we could see where things are at. Well, yes, but I don't recommend that. Okay, well, that's not quite the same as we know this is going to happen. Now, that's very simplistic, I understand. But there's a lot of factors to be taken into consideration. But we're going to skip stuff on after the break. We won't get to everything. We used to use the terms ordinary and extraordinary. That kind of got co-opted in the medical field. So ordinary became what's called ordinary medical-wise is, what's routine, what's cost-effective, those types of things. So the Catholic Church has really swung, and now they use terms of proportionate and disproportionate care. Should we do this or should we not do it? So it's proportionate is if in the given circumstances there's some reasonable hope of benefit and it's not too burdensome. It's disproportionate if the converse is true. Okay? So here was Marlise Munoz. I think this was the woman in Texas that had, she was pronounced brain dead after being found unconscious in the tub, I think, if I remember right, at 14th week of gestation. The Texas law would not allow this to be terminated. Viability was at 22 weeks. They did pull off life support at 21 weeks. All right. So it's a difficult case. There's no doubt about it. But all the factors that have to be considered. What are the survival chances of the unborn? Okay, now that has to be considered, but that's not a determining factor. In other words, unless we know for sure that there's no chance. I'm not talking is there 1%, but hey, if we get this woman the viability, in other words, we're maintaining a woman who is brain dead. On life support. So is she, in a sense, a non-living uterus is what we're talking here. At least that's what, and there's some ifs about this. We're being clear here just for the sake of discussion, but not all this stuff was forthcoming, so they didn't really know. Plus, we're going to see later, what does brain dead mean? We're talking whole brain dead, we're talking loss of cognitive functions. So they were discussing the bodily support of the brain dead mother. They were making the case that the poor quality of life of the child once born. Maybe they were saying the child will only live 2 weeks. We have to put the child on fetal life support. Well, if it's not too disproportionate and we're able to do so, that's not really a concern, right? Although it could be in other countries that don't have access to this. Emotional pain and distress of the family. They wanted to bury their wife and mother. We understand that. But we're talking about 2 persons here. We're not talking about just one person. This is not an easy one. This is probably one of the more difficult cases you'll come by. And even though, I think since in the last 20 years, 15 years, 30 or 40 of these have happened globally, so it's not like it never happens. All right? And then we also have to consider the charitable care of women's corpus. It's not just a container, There's a lot of stuff that goes into this. So, where I came down on this was, if we were at 14 weeks when the first decision was being made, that would change things. But they terminated life support at 21 weeks. I don't know. That wasn't good for me. But there were other people, bioethics that I talked to, that said, she's dead. It was just the machine keeping her alive. It's a difficult case. But nonetheless, in my mother's condition, getting the anal-vaginal fistula fixed, that seemed proportionate. To try to do something invasive, to just check out what if it was cancer. I mean, the oncologist said, what else could it be? And I even asked him. I mean, the nurse even was backing me because I was so resistant. I'm not doing it. And I said, what is your goal? Let's say you go in with exploratory surgery, and then you find that it is cancerous. What would be the treatment? She can't withstand any treatment. See, at that point, I'm already in disproportionate care. And he said, well, wouldn't you want to know for genetic reasons? I said, if I die at that age of lung cancer, I mean, God bless me. I mean, at some point, we're going to die of something, I mean, it wasn't like there was some congenital thing that he was 42 years old and you need to do an autopsy to find out if somebody else might carry this gene, that type of thing. So you start weighing out proportionate and disproportionate situations, and then you've got to determine, by using the previous principle, double effect, is what I'm going to be doing good. So even a person who's, say, they're going in for dialysis 3 times a week, and they've been doing this for 5 years, and they want to discontinue it, that's okay. At some point, we are going to consider emotional pain and distress, and that is your decision. You're not committing suicide, you're accepting the inevitability of death, at some point. The same way that if you were older enough and somebody said, well, we'd like to go in and try to treat this particular cancer. I'm good, I live a long life, I'm healthy, I don't want to go through chemo, I don't want to go through radiation, I'm at peace with myself, that's permissible. That's permissible. All right. Okay, I know that's a lot. We'll pick a few things out to do it after the break, so let's take 10.